Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So, as I promised, every few weeks I'll read from a hadith on the Prophet ﷺ or Shama'il of the Prophet ﷺ. And I really, like I told you, I really like the narrations that come from Ali. His ones are very poetic, it's very beautiful. But I'm not going out looking for them. It just so happens that this book and the other book I use have a lot of narrations from the Prophet ﷺ. This particular one is in regards to the gatherings of the Prophet ﷺ. When the Prophet was around, how people were around him and how he was. So if you're ready to listen, I'll read it to you. So Al-Hussein ibn Ali ibn Abi Talib narrated, I then asked him, Ali, about his interaction with people outside his house. He replied, the Messenger of Allah controlled his tongue, only speaking regarding that which concerned him. He brought unity amongst the people and did not alienate them. He honored the esteemed ones of every group and made them the leaders of their groups. He warned the people and was cautious when dealing with the people to preserve his status amongst them, but he never lacked courtesy towards them. Those who were close to him were the best of people, the best of whom in his eyes were the ones who wished everybody well, and the ones with the highest status in his eyes were the ones with the most compassion, who aided the creation the most. I then asked my father regarding the gatherings of the Messenger ﷺ, and he replied, the Messenger of Allah ﷺ began and ended all of his sittings with the remembrance of Allah. When he came to a gathering, he sat where there was space available and instructed the people to do the same. He gave every attendee his due respect and right to a degree that led every individual present to think that he was the honoring him the most. When an individual came to sit with him or came regarding some issue, he, Sallallahu would remain seated until that person began to rise. Whenever he was asked for something, he would fulfill that request and did not refuse it. And if he did not possess that which was required, he would advise the person with soft and kind words. His affection and good manners were for all and not restricted to certain people. He was like a father to them, and he was just and fair with each one of them. His gatherings were the gatherings of knowledge, humility, patience, and trustworthiness. In his gatherings, voices were not raised, and vile and unlawful topics were refrained from. If anyone committed a fault, it was not publicized. All were regarded as equals amongst themselves, and superiority was according to the piety possessed. Therein, the old were respected, the young were loved, the needy were given preference, and strangers and travelers were cared for, and his gems were observed attentively and memorized. That's really beautiful. I particularly like I don't know if you know the story of how I became Muslim. I'm not going to say it now, but one of the things that attracted me to Islam from the Prophet's Seerah wasn't the big things. No, it wasn't the splitting of the moon or the revelation coming down. Those were pretty good, but what really attracted me was the little things he had. Like when he walked in and he'll sit wherever there was space. It didn't matter. He didn't have to sit at the front. He never asked anyone to reserve a spot for him. He'll sit at the back sometimes, or he'll sit in the middle, wherever he can, and he never thought it was an issue. He never liked when people stood up when he walked in. He just sat quietly in a corner. This was the Prophet ﷺ. So I always found those things the most beautiful. Okay, so do we remember where we left off last week? Anyone remember what happened? We covered some big topics. We did Isra and Miraj, and we did Aisha's age, and we talked about the two theories of her age. And we pretty much ended with Isra and Miraj. So, Isra and Miraj has just happened, and the Prophet ﷺ goes back to, remember where he was? Do you remember whose house he was staying at? Hani's, his cousin. So he goes back to Hani's house, and he tells Hani what happened. Hani is shocked. She's so scared that as the Prophet ﷺ is leaving, she actually grabs his cloak and he says, please, promise me you will not tell this to anyone. What does the Prophet do? He walks out the house and goes straight to the Kaaba and tells everyone of what happened at Isra and Miraj. This begins a very hard time because all the Quraysh literally crack up. They start laughing and they start insulting and mocking him and saying, how could such a ludicrous thing happen? You went to Jerusalem in one night, it's about a 3 weeks journey. And you went and you saw the prophets and they don't believe him. This is not only hard for the Prophet ﷺ, but it's actually hard for the Muslims. Especially, you have to remember, a lot of these Muslims are quote unquote new Muslims. And suddenly this bombshell is dropped on them. But Abu Bakr, when they came to Abu Bakr and he said, do you know what your friend is saying? And do you believe him? His response was, yes, if he says it, it is true. I believe the revelation comes to him from heaven to earth. So why would I not believe this? When the Prophet ﷺ is told what Abu Bakr says, the Prophet ﷺ calls him As-Siddiq. This is when Abu Bakr gets the title As-Siddiq. Now, this has all happened. And do you remember how many times the Prophet ﷺ has talked to by now to the people of Yathrib? So up till this point, how many times has he talked to the people of Yathrib? Twice. The first time was when a delegation came to ask the Quraysh to help them resolve their problems. And in that group, there was only one person who accepted Islam. His name was Sa'd ibn Mu'adh. He is Iyas ibn Mu'adh. Very young boy. He accepted Islam, but unfortunately when he went back to Yathrib, he passed away. The second one was what we call the pre-Akaba pledge. We call it the pre-Akaba pledge. And we're going to cover the Akaba pledges this week, but that was the pre-Akaba pledge amongst 6 people. They didn't necessarily give a pledge to the Prophet ﷺ, but they remembered what this Jewish holy man had said about an Arab prophet coming, and they said he might be the one, and we should probably start believing him. So they kept it in the back of his mind, right? So 2 times. Now, the third time is happening now, and this time is very, very important. It makes a big, big milestone in the Seerah. Now, in Yathrib at this time, a massive battle had just happened between the Aus and Khazraj. You know how I was saying they were always at each other's throats? They had just had a massive battle, and these 2 tribes are now really quite sick of battling and fighting. They decided that they were going to elect one leader, one Arab leader to keep the unity. And a name was thrown in. Anyone know what the name was? Abdullah ibn Ubay. Remember that name. Keep that in the back of your mind. Abdullah ibn Ubay is going to start popping up quite a bit. So while these conversations are happening in Yathrib, the 6 people who came to the Prophet ﷺ before in the pre-Akaba pledge, they remembered the Prophet. And they said, let's go meet the Prophet. So 6 of them and 7 other people came from Yathrib to speak to the Prophet ﷺ. They invited the Prophet ﷺ and they said, come to Yathrib, come and bring some peace to our place. There's too many battles, too many fights going on. And the Prophet ﷺ says, in response, he says, come here and pledge that you will not associate any with Allah, that you will not steal, nor commit unlawful sexual intercourse, nor kill your children, nor utter slander intentionally, forging falsehood, nor disobey him in any good. He who fulfills this, Allah will reward him. And he who neglects this is afflicted in this world, and it may prove redemption for him in the hereafter. And if the sin remains hidden from the eyes of men, and no grief comes to him, then he has his affairs with Allah. He may forgive him, or he may not. So pretty much he kind of summarizes what he expects the people of Yathrib, their spiritual status should be, and how they would relay that in their actions as well. This very short speech by the Prophet ﷺ is known as the first Akaba pledge. The reason Akaba, because it was the region, the area in Mecca known as Akaba. So this happened between, I think there was 13 people. Yeah, 13 people all up. The terms of the Akaba pledge were like this: associate nothing with God, do not steal, do not fornicate, do not practice infanticide, do not slander, do not disobey the Prophet in that which is right. This first Akaba pledge, if you just bear that in mind, try to remember the terms, because we're going to come to the second Akaba pledge and you'll see the difference. And there is a really big importance as to why the Prophet ﷺ made it this way. Now, all 13 agreed, and several years later, Surah Al-Fatah was revealed, which describes this event. With these 13 people, the Prophet ﷺ sends one of the Sahaba. Anyone know what the Sahaba's name was? Any idea which Sahaba was sent to Yathrib? Musab ibn Umair, yes. Musab ibn Umair is sent to Yathrib. Now, Musab does an incredible job. He's in Yathrib for 11 months, and that whole time, he's the one who always leads. And there's a reason for that. Because if someone from the Khazraj leads, the Aus gets upset. If the Aus leads, the Khazraj will get upset. There's so much tension between the two tribes that Musab says, no, neither of you are going to lead. I will lead the prayers. And while he's there, he teaches the people of Yathrib about Islam and how to pray and all the basics of Islam. And he was very young. Yeah, Musab ibn Umair was also very young. And he used to have his gatherings in the house of a Khazraj Muslim, a Yathrib, Muslim from Yathrib. This annoyed the Aus a little bit. And one of the people that it annoys was the chief, Sa'd ibn Mu'ad. Sa'd ibn Mu'ad didn't like the fact that, one, he didn't like the fact that Muslims were having gatherings. Two, he didn't like it that was happening amongst the Khazraj. At this time, most of the Muslims from Yathrib were from the Khazraj clan, less so from Aus. So what does Sa'd do? Sa'd asks one of his friends, Usaid, who is a pretty big guy, go there and break up that meeting. Right? I'm assuming he was pretty scary as well. So he sends Usaid there. A few minutes later, Usaid comes back and he says, I have embraced Islam. He'd gone and he had heard Musab reciting the Quran and he had accepted Islam. Sa'd's furious. So Sa'd says, if you want the job done right, you have to do it yourself. So he storms off to chase all the people away. As he's nearing the gathering, he hears Musab reciting Quran and his heart starts to shake and he accepts Islam. Now this is a big moment because this is the first time a chief of Yathrib accepts Islam, and through him, he was from the Aus clan, through him many of the Aus tribesmen become Muslim. And they get a very strong ally in Yathrib. So Musab stays there for about 11 months. And he returns to the Prophet ﷺ and informs him that there's quite a number of Muslims in Yathrib, and the numbers are growing exponentially. The response is much stronger in Yathrib than it was in Mecca. Now we get to the second Akaba pledge, right? Shortly after Musab's return, 73 men and 2 women come to Mecca to do Hajj from Yathrib. So there's 62 Khazraj and 11 Aus. Remember how I said it's primarily more Khazraj in the initial stages? So 62 Khazraj, 11 Aus, and 2 women amongst them come to do Hajj. While they're doing Hajj, they send a secret message to the Prophet ﷺ saying, let's meet in secret in Akaba again. And they say, we are willing to help you escape from Mecca. When the message comes, the Prophet ﷺ decides to meet them, but Abbas ibn Abu Talib, his uncle, says, no, this could be a trap. I don't trust this. He said, I'm going to come with you. At this time, Abbas ibn Abu Talib is not Muslim, but he loves his nephew and he's standing by his nephew. But the sad thing is, he doesn't become Muslim for quite a while. Even at the Battle of Badr, he actually fights against the Muslims. And he's captured at Badr, and it was only after he was captured and he sees how the Muslims treat the prisoners, he becomes Muslim. But he still loves his nephew, so he says, I'm coming with you. So Abbas comes and meets the 73 people from Yathrib. And Abbas tells the people of Yathrib this. He says, O people of Khazraj, because mainly they're the Khazraj, right? So he says, O people of Khazraj, all of you know the position that Muhammad holds amongst us. We have protected him from our people as much as we could. He is honored and respected amongst his people. He refuses to join any party except you. So if you think you can carry out what you promised while inviting him to your town, if you can defend him against the enemies, then assume the burden that you have taken. But if you are going to surrender him and betray him after having taken him away with you, you had better leave him now, because he is respected and well defended in his own place. Abbas is pretty much saying, look, we protected him all this time. You're now coming and saying you're going to stand by him, fine. He's willing to listen to you, but don't go back on it. You have to understand, if you stand by this man, the rest of the Arabian Peninsula, all the tribes will be against you. Are you willing to take that on? And again, they say, yes, we are willing to take that burden. So the Prophet ﷺ recites the Quran and he makes a pledge and he says, I give you my pledge that you protect me from whatever you protect your women and your children from. So he says, the pledge I'm asking of you, if you want me to come with you, is that you protect me the same way you protect yourself, your women, and your children from anything that you protect them from. The interesting thing, this is also shows you the character of the Prophet ﷺ, right? The interesting thing is, when the Battle of Badr happened, the Prophet ﷺ didn't go to the Aus and Khazraj and say, remember the pledge, you need to come and fight. The reason is, the pledge that happened was for defensive purposes. The Battle of Badr was offensive. So he said, they're not bound by the pledge. I can only ask them, I request that you join us, but you're not bound by the pledge. He could have said, he could have twisted the language and the legalistics and said, you made a pledge. He said, no, you're not bound by it because it was a defensive pledge. This is an offensive battle, but if you would like, please join us. And they did. So the pledge is made, but one of the 73 asks the Prophet ﷺ, okay, we've just made a pledge to you, and we've said we will protect you. But what happens after we protect you, you are victorious, what if you go back to Mecca? Because you're from Mecca, you have no connection with Yathrib. What if you leave us and go back? And the Prophet ﷺ's response was this, he said, nay, it would never be. Your blood will be my blood. In life and death, I will be with you, and you with me. I will fight with whom you fight, and I will make peace with whom you make peace. Pretty much the Prophet ﷺ is saying, I am going to be part of your city till the end. And he is, till the end. He is buried in Yathrib. So he pretty much gives up his whole life in Mecca, and he says, I will be amongst you. I will be amongst your people. Now the terms of the second Akaba pledge was this, to listen and obey in all difficulty and ease, to spend in plenty as well as scarcity, to enjoy good and forbid evil. In Allah's service you will fear the censure of none, and to aid the Prophet ﷺ when he comes to you, and to protect him from anything you protect yourself, your spouse, and your children from. Do you see the difference? The first Akaba pledge was about one's spirituality and one's behavior and one's character. The second Akaba pledge is more about the things of this world, the politics, the military, the protection, the defense. It's an alliance that is made. But both had to happen because we are now moving from Islam as a purely religious, spiritual aspect to a political aspect. This is why the Akaba pledges are so important. This is kind of where the big shift is happening. We don't lose the religious aspect, but then the political aspect joins to it. And this is a lot of an issue that a lot of people from the Western world have, is that when you say religion, for a lot of people, religion is a very private thing, and it is a very spiritual thing, and it's very between you and your God, which is true in Islam as well. This aspect is there. But there is also a very social, communal, political part of it. And this growth of the political part of Islam is now happening with these pledges. The Prophet ﷺ is going from a religious leader to a state leader. Just briefly, I said there was two women. I like to speak about women in the Seerah because there is an assumption that it's all about men, but it's not. It's not at all. We've already we're about little less than halfway through the Seerah, and we've already seen many, many, many great women. One of the great Sahabi was a woman by the name of Nusayba ibn, I've forgotten the name. Anyone know Nusayba ibn? Hang on, I'll get it. Nusayba binti Kab, sorry, not ibn, binti Kab. Have you heard of that name, Nusayba? Do you know the Sahabi Nusayba? Nusayba insisted that because she was part of the second pledge, because she was there, she insisted that when the Battle of Uhud happened, she has to fight. Usually women don't fight. Nusayba was like, no, I gave my pledge to protect, I will fight. And so she actually went to the Battle of Uhud, and she is known as the Warrior Sahabi. She rode on horses, she shot arrows, and she actually fought ferociously. There is even one account where the Prophet ﷺ was surrounded by the enemies at Uhud, and she came riding on a horse and literally jumped off the saddle into the midst of the horse, into the midst of the enemy, and was slashing all of them. So this, if you want to think of a warrior Sahabi, this is Nusayba bint Ka'b. Now with the first and second Akaba pledges, like I said, there was a massive political shift. And the previous alliances in Yathrib to the Jewish tribes and the proxy wars came to an end. So obviously the Jewish tribes were not very happy with what the status quo starting to fall apart. But now with the pledge given and the people from Yathrib, both Aus and Khazraj, saying that we are ready, the Muslims in Mecca start to slowly migrate to Yathrib. The first family was Abu Salama. Abu Salama and his wife, Salama, and their son secretly start to leave from Mecca to Yathrib. But on their way, they're captured. They're stopped by the Quraysh, and Abu Salama and Salama and their sons are separated. Abu Salama manages to go to Yathrib. Salama and the son is kept behind. A few days later, they escaped again and decide that they're going to go by themselves, which is, it's about a 3-day journey for a woman and a young boy to travel by themselves. As they're leaving, they come across Uthman ibn Talha from the tribe of Abdul. Uthman ibn Talha is not a Muslim, but he sees the plight that this woman is, and he says, look, it's not right that you travel along. I will take you all the way to Medina. Now this is a big ask. This is close to a 3 days journey. He's coming, I'm not sure where he's coming from, but he's coming from somewhere. And he says, you know what, I'll stop my journey. I will escort you all the way to Medina. So he escorts Salama and her son all the way to Kuba, and then he comes back all the way back. The Prophet ﷺ hears of this virtue of this man. And later, when the conquest of Mecca happens, and Uthman ibn Talha accepts Islam, the keys of the Kaaba are given to him because he's part of the clan of Abdul. Remember, Abdul is the clan that holds the keys of the Kaaba, and in honor of what he did, he's provided the keys of the Kaaba, and his descendants to this day hold the keys of the Kaaba. So it's a bit of a side story, but it's a very interesting one. Other Sahabas like Hisham ibn Alas and Aish ibn Abi Rabia are also captured. They try to leave and they're captured. Interesting story with Aish. Aish was leaving with Omar. And as they were leaving, we're talking about Omar ibn al-Khattab, as they were leaving, Aish's half-brother, Abu Jahal, and Harith ibn Hisham come to him and say, look, Aish, you can't leave. Your mother is so sad that you're leaving. She has vowed that she's not going to comb her hair and she will sit in the sun until you come back. And Omar, in true Omar fashion, says, let her. When it gets too hot, she'll go into the shade. When her head gets itchy with lice, she will comb it. Don't fall for this. And Aisha says, no, I can't. It's my mother. I have to go check. So he says, I'll come back. And as they're coming back, when they get near to Mecca, Abu Jahal and Hisham jump on him. They beat him up. They tie him. And they drag him into Mecca like a slave. And they start telling all the people of Mecca or Quraysh, look how we treat our foolish ones. You should treat your fools the way we have treated our fool. So the Quraysh are actively trying to stop the Muslims from leaving Medina at this time. Aish is taken back, and both Aish and Hisham are tortured, and they're tortured to the point that they renounce Islam. When they renounce Islam, they're heartbroken. They're so upset. They think that's it. There's no forgiveness for me. There's no paradise. We are doomed. But at the same time, the Surah Az-Zumar is revealed, and some of the Muslims manage to write it on a paper and smuggle it to Aish and Hisham. The Surah Az-Zumar is about forgiveness. If you did a great sin and you turn to Allah, He will forgive you. This surah keeps all the Muslims who are in captivity and who had to renounce, it gives them hope, it gives them comfort. And they continue to pray and continue to practice in secret. So we're talking about over a few months now, slowly and very secretly in the night, the Muslims are escaping Mecca. At this point, so many people have left Mecca that there are now streets in Mecca that are empty. And this alarms the Quraysh, because prior to this, the Muslims were secret, right? So you couldn't really quantify how many Muslims there were. You had an idea, they had an idea, it was growing, but they didn't know exactly how many. But when the Muslims start leaving Mecca and they go to Yathrib and streets are becoming empty, they start realizing how many people have accepted Islam. And this becomes a real worry for them. Nearly all the close Sahaba have also left. And with the Prophet ﷺ, remaining is Ali and Abu Bakr from the close Sahaba. Anyone know why the Prophet ﷺ didn't leave? Yes, he was waiting for the order. There's a few reasons. He was waiting for the order. Anyone know why scholars think the order hadn't come yet?
Did he have like trust?
The scholars say 2 reasons. There was trust as well, yeah. There was 2 reasons mainly. One is, it's the saying that the captain leaves the ship last. He wanted to make sure all his community was out and safe before he did. The second reason was that he wanted to make sure that people he trusted and he knew had established themselves in Yathrib, and that Yathrib was safe when he comes to establish the community. So it's for both reasons. But also the main reason, like you said, is that he wasn't given permission. And we know this because Abu Bakr comes to him and says, Ya Rasulullah, will you give me permission to leave? And he says, wait a bit, Abu Bakr, because I'm hoping I will get permission to leave and you can come with me. Just at this time, the Prophet ﷺ is struck a blow. Things are going well, and he's thinking, finally, after all the hardship, things are going well, but then he's struck a blow. His protector Mu'attim, remember Mu'attim? The guy who, one of the 5 who broke down the ban, he was one of the people who protected the Prophet. He was one of the people that the Prophet respected. And he was one of the people that he said after Badr, if he had asked, I would have released all the prisoners free of charge. He respected him so much. Unfortunately, Mu'attim dies at an early age. This means the Prophet ﷺ suddenly loses all protection. He has no one protecting him. His clan is not protecting him because the chief of his clan, Banu Hisham, is Abu Lahab. So now there's a pretty big problem. The Quraysh immediately, under the leadership of Abu Jahl, organize a meeting. And they say, this is our chance to get rid of Muhammad once and for all. So they meet and they discuss different opinions and they finally come to one decision. They say, the only way to get rid of this business of Islam and Muhammad is to kill him. And they come up with a plan. They say, if we take one person from each tribe and they strike him down at the same time, Banu Hashim can't fight all the tribes. They can't pick a fight with all of us, so they will have to accept blood money. We'll give them blood money. End of story, problem solved. It was supposed to be something like, Julius Caesar, how he got stabbed by, this is the same thing. They made a plan like that. So one night, each member of the clan that was chosen, they go to the Prophet ﷺ's house. And one interesting thing, Abu Lahab, his uncle, is very conveniently absent from these meetings because it wouldn't look good if he's there. But he also doesn't want to oppose it, so he finds an excuse and doesn't go to that meeting. Jibreel, though, comes to Prophet ﷺ and tells him what's happening. He says, there is an assassination in place, this is what you need to do, and Allah has given you permission now to leave to Yathrib. Immediately the Prophet ﷺ goes and tells Abu Bakr that it is time. It's time for us to leave to Yathrib. He also goes to Ali and he tells Ali, and he gives Ali a very difficult task. He says, Ali, you need to stay back and you need to settle all the debts. Because, not the debts, but the money given in trust. Because even though the Quraysh hated him, and even though the Quraysh wanted to kill him, they couldn't think of anyone more trustworthy than him. So all their money, they left with him. He was like the bank for them. They left all their trust when they went on trading trips, they'd leave it with him. So the Prophet ﷺ says, you can't just abandon that. They gave it in trust, we must return it. Ali, can you stay back and return it? And that means Ali will be the only Muslim now of the Sahabas, the Sahaba we know who are in Mecca. He also gives Ali another very difficult task. He gives him his cloak and he says, wear my cloak and sleep in my bed and I promise you no harm will come. You got to think about what's going through Ali's mind. Someone came to me and he said, there's a plan like this, they're going to assassinate me when I'm in my bed, but I'm not going to be in my bed, you're going to be in my bed and they won't assassinate, you'll be fine. It shows you the level of trust that Ali had. So Ali puts on the cloak and he goes to the Prophet ﷺ's bed, and now all these people have gathered around the house. And they're waiting for the Prophet ﷺ to come out. Just as he opens the door, they're going to stab him. Initially, the plan was for them to break into the house. But they hear the Prophet ﷺ's wives talking, and they think that's dishonorable. It's not the right thing to do, so we're just going to wait out till he comes. The Prophet ﷺ walks up to the door, and he starts reciting Yasin. And when he got to the part about, and we have enshrouded them so they see not, he opens the door. And he opens the door and steps out right amongst all these people. And he literally walks between these people and they cannot see him. Literally, he walks through these dozens of people with knives. As he's walking down the dark street, he comes past another person who's coming that way, and he walks past them. And that person that goes past the Prophet's house, and he sees all the people gathered around. And he says, what are you waiting for? And they're saying, we're waiting for Muhammad. And he's like, what are you waiting for Muhammad for? He just went quite a while back. I just passed him. And they get the how? We surrounded the house. It's impossible. So they go and they peep through the window and they see that there's someone in the bed with the cloak. So they said, it's fine. He's still here. He must have been mistaken. So they're still waiting. Morning comes and Ali opens the door with the cloak on and they realize what's happened. So the plan worked. The delay gave enough time for the Prophet ﷺ to escape with Abu Bakr. Now the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr knew that soon as the Quraysh find out, they will chase after them. So instead of heading north, because Medina's north, Yathrib, we're still calling it Yathrib, Yathrib's north and Mecca's south. Instead of going north, they go 8 kilometers south to a mountain called, anyone know what the mountain's called? Tower. There's a mountain called Tower, and in the base of that mountain was a cave, and they decide to hide there. And they also come up with another plan, that as they're walking south, a Sahaba, a great Sahaba, by the name of Amir ibn Fuhaira, will take a herd of sheep and drive the sheep behind them. So the sheep covers the footsteps. There's a reason why I said Amir ibn Fuhaira is a great Sahaba. Anyone know why? He's not a well-known one. Unfortunately, I don't know why he's not well-known, but he is an amazing Sahaba. Anyone know why? Anyone know of this Sahaba?
Was he the one who was given the crown of one of the emperors?
No. Amir ibn Fuhaira was a slave who had embraced Islam, and Abu Bakr had freed him. Abu Bakr had freed a lot of Muslim slaves, so he was one of them. After the Battle of Uhud, Amir ibn Fuhaira and 40 other Muslims were sent to the tribe of Banu Amr on a peaceful delegation, but on their way they're ambushed, and 37 of the 40 are killed. The three, and including Amir ibn Fuhaira, the three that managed to escape comes to the Prophet ﷺ and says something miraculous. He says, when the bodies were killed, and they're killed, we actually saw the body of Amir ibn Fuhaira being lifted up to heaven. They come and tell the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet says, yes, that is true. And later they are sent back to retrieve the bodies, and they find all the bodies except Amir's. So I say great because he's not really that big in the story of the Seerah, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loved this particular person so much that his entire body was taken up into heaven. And he started off as a slave. Now, to travel fast, Abu Bakr and Prophet ﷺ took very little provisions. The plan was that they will go and hide in this cave, and they'll stay hidden in the cave until all the pursuit dies off. And in the meantime, Abu Bakr's daughter, Asma, and his son, Abdullah, will secretly bring them food. Now, Asma had a girdle. Girdle's like a big belt. Think of like a big belt around the waist. He had a girdle, and she took the girdle off and ripped it in two to tie the provisions to the mule. And this is how she got the title, the one who has two girdles, because he took one girdle and ripped it off. They would secretly bring food to Abu Bakr and the Prophet ﷺ. Now, back in Mecca, when the Quraysh found out that the Prophet ﷺ had escaped, they were furious. So they put a bounty. They said 100 camels for the head of Abu Bakr and 100 camels for the head of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. That's 200 camels. That is a fortune. Like, literally, it's a small fortune. And to get this, many mercenaries set out. They didn't know where they were, so they spread out. All from Mecca, they went north, south, east, west, they went everywhere. One of these mercenary parties came towards the mountain. that the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr were hiding in. And Abu Bakr starts stressing. He gets very, very worried. And Prophet ﷺ says, Abu Bakr, what do you think of two when their third is Allah? They stop worrying. There's the two of us, yes, but the third with us is Allah. Nothing will happen to us. And Surah Tawbah, verse 14, talks about this situation. Now, Abu Bakr and the Prophet ﷺ escaped from capture because of two small miracles. Anyone know what these two small miracles are? The dove nest. So when the mercenaries come towards the entrance of the cave, they see two things. They see a spider web at the entrance, and they think, well, that can't be right, because if there was someone hiding in the cave, the spider web would have been broken. And they see a nest of a dove nearby with the dove sitting. And they think, well, that also can't be right. If there's someone there, the dove would have flown off. So they think, no point searching the cave, let's keep moving. While they're hiding in the cave, Abu Bakr notices certain holes in the wall. And at this time, the Prophet ﷺ had fallen asleep on Abu Bakr's lap. Now, Abu Bakr starts worrying that a snake or scorpion would come out of these holes. So to protect the Prophet ﷺ, he starts ripping his clothes and shoving it. And then he gets to a point that he runs out of cloak to shove. And so what he does, he shoves his hand into the remaining holes. I say this story because it shows you the character of Abu Bakr and the love he had for the Prophet ﷺ. As his hand is shoved into the hole, he is bitten by something in there. And he keeps holding his hand in there, and the pain gets so immense that he can't bear it anymore, and he moves slightly. This wakes the Prophet ﷺ up, and he asks, what's wrong, Abu Bakr? And Abu Bakr says, I'm in a lot of pain, something has bitten me. And the Prophet ﷺ takes Abu Bakr's hand, recites, and spits on it, and he's immediately healed. That's one example of the love that Abu Bakr had for the Prophet ﷺ. There's a second example. After 3 days, the Abu Bakr hires a local Bedouin guide. Actually, before that, I'll just talk about something else. Once they came out of the cave, Abu Bakr had a camel by the name of, what was the Prophet's camel? Anyone know? Do you know the name of the Prophet's camel? Qaswa. Qaswa actually belonged to Abu Bakr before. And he had hidden Qaswa away. So when they came out of the cave, Abu Bakr said, let me give you my camel for you to ride. And the Prophet said, no, I will buy it off you. I will not take him as a gift, I will buy it off you. Do you have an idea of why that is? Any idea why the Prophet refused to take it?
Doing what's needed for
Yeah. So Hamza Yusuf has a really good explanation. He says this, because this was hijrah for the sake of Allah, and the Prophet ﷺ wanted to take every reward in it. And so he refused to take it as a gift because he was expending his wealth to go fi sabilillah to Medina. It is important to remember that the Prophet ﷺ is a believer. You can forget that because of his maqam, his position, but you have to remember the commands that are in the Quran are commands to him as well as anybody else. And he gave all his wealth away, and he never went to bed with any wealth, and that is fi sabilillah. This is very interesting. When we are doing the seerah, we always see the Prophet as the Prophet. We forget he is also a believer like we are. And he also strived to pray in the night and to get hasanah. And he did all those things just as we are expected to do. And so this is an example of where he didn't want to take a gift because he wanted to get the hasanah of what he was doing, and he paid for it. So anyway, going back, Abu Bakr hires a local Bedouin guide. This particular Bedouin guide was well known for his trustworthiness and virtue. However, he was not Muslim. And Tariq Ramadan makes a comment on this. He says, it's interesting to note that the Prophet ﷺ many times would bring close to him or use or hire people who were not Muslim. He hired them on the qualities of their character and their ability to do a task, sometimes even over Muslims. So he respected a human for their ability and their character, and not just for the religion as well. He always weighed it out and decided. And this was a perfect example where they hired a non-Muslim guide, but who they knew was trustworthy and would be honorable. So they then start to head back north along the Red Sea, back towards Yathrib. As they're nearing Yathrib, and it's interesting, I wish I had the PowerPoint slide because there's a map and you can see the caravan route from Mecca to Yathrib goes almost pretty much straight. It swerves a little bit, but straight. The route that Abu Bakr and Prophet ﷺ did was they went south, then they literally zigzagged. They zigzagged across the whole thing up to Yathrib to avoid any pursuits. As they're nearing Yathrib, they see before them a caravan coming and they start to get worried. They think, is this a caravan belonging to the Quraysh? But luckily, as the caravan nears, they see that it is owned by Talha ibn Ubaidullah. Remember Talha? Who's Talha? Talha is Abu Bakr's cousin, and he embraced Islam with Uthman. Remember Uthman when he was in the desert and he said, awake, Ahmad has come? And he ran into Talha, and Talha said, when I was in Syria, a priest told me about Ahmad, and they both became Muslims. This same Talha. Correct. So Talha is coming, and they see the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr, and he stops and he feeds them, gives them water, and gives them new clothes. This is really significant, because what are the chances of this happening, right? But Allah made it that so when the Prophet ﷺ and Abu Bakr enters Yathrib, he is not entering as a traveler who's dirty from travel, or a refugee, or someone who, he is entering with new clothes, fresh, as someone that can be respected by this new community. Nothing's a coincidence, really. Nothing's a coincidence, but it's amazing how it's a small incident. A lot of Seerah books actually don't talk about that. But there is a meaning even in that. But before Yathrib, they're near a town known as, just outside Yathrib. Anyone know what this particular special town is? Quba. They're near the town of Quba. And in Quba, there's a massive crowd waiting to see the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet goes to them and he says this, O people, give unto one another greetings of peace. Feed food unto the hungry, honor the ties of kingship, pray in the hours when men sleep, even so shall you enter paradise. That's all he says. He stays in Quba for 3 days. He stays with, I think it was a Khazraj house, and Abu Bakr stays in the Aus house. Again, to make sure that no one gets upset. So they stay in separate houses. In that 3 days, the Prophet ﷺ lays the foundation for the first mosque in the world. So a lot of, if you're doing an Islamic quiz, a lot of the quiz questions is, where was the first mosque built? Mecca, Medina, neither of those places. It was built first in Quba, which you can go to this day. On the third day, shortly after entering Quba, Ali joins them as well. So he has paid off, written all the money, and Ali now joins him. So now pretty much all the Muslims, except for the ones who are in prison or captured, have left Mecca and is close to Yathrib or in Yathrib. On the third day, they leave and they stop at the valley of Ranuna, where the Prophet ﷺ leads a congregational prayer. There, he meets 100 Muslims who are dressed in their best battle clothes. They're wearing battle armor, and they come and they say, we will escort you in to Yathrib. And the Prophet ﷺ rides into Yathrib on Qaswa to the sounds of Tala al-Badru alayna and people waving palm leaves. He is now entering as a head of state, a statesman. I don't want to say king, but a leader with political and military power, with an escort of 100 armed soldiers next to him. We're on week 10 of the Seerah. Do you remember when we started on week 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, how of a difficult position he was in? And now suddenly how Allah has brought him to a point where he is entering into a city of people singing praises to him, waving palm leaves, and an escort of 100 armed soldiers. It's pretty amazing if you think of it. It gives you goosebumps of how things happen. This is about the 13th year since Revelation came. So about 13 years after Revelation first came. From this point onwards, when we do the seerah, I will be referring to Yathrib as Medina. The full name is Medina al-Munawwara, which is the city of light. And thereafter, everyone calls Yathrib Medina. Yathrib is not mentioned again. Now, when the Prophet ﷺ enters, everyone's question is, where is he going to build his house and mosque? It's a significant question because the Aus and Khazraj are still quite annoyed with each other. There's still old resentments. So they're wondering, where would he get the land? Is he going to go with a Khazraj land or an Aus land? And you see the intelligence and the wisdom of the Prophet ﷺ. What does he do? He lets go of the reins of Qaswa. And he lets the camel choose. So the camel walks through the city of Medina and he stops at a particular place, at a land that belongs, and this is again one of the miracle, is that the camel stops at a land that belongs to two poor orphans. You see how Allah works? He could have made the camel stop at a very rich person's house, but he stopped at the land of two poor orphans. Their names are Suhail and Sahal. And when Suhail and Sahal is told that the Prophet ﷺ has come and he would like to build his house and his mosque on your land, they're thrilled. And they come to the Prophet ﷺ and they say, we give it to you as a gift. And the Prophet says, no, I will buy it at full price. The reason, again, is one of those little miracles that I love, is that the camel chose two orphans, two poor orphans. Not only did they get financial assistance, but now their names are locked in for history. Forever and ever, Muslims will know their name, and forever and ever, Masjid al-Nabawi will stand on their land. That's how Allah raises, the poorest from nothing to suddenly this amazing status. Exactly. Can you imagine? Can you imagine when all these big people and all these noble and rich and massive, and the mosque is built on the land of two orphans? Now, while this is happening, a Sahaba quickly goes to Qaswa, grabs the Prophet's belongings and takes it to his house to make sure that the Prophet ﷺ stays with him and nobody else. Anyone know who this Sahaba is? Abu Ayyub al-Ansari or Abu Ayyub ibn Zayd. His real name is Abu Ayyub ibn Zayd. We know him as Abu Ayyub al-Ansari. He is, again, one of the most amazing Sahaba. He was one of the 12 who was part of the second Akaba pledge, and he remained close to the Prophet ﷺ, took part in every military expedition. And when he was very old, now this is a very interesting thing about Abu Ayyub, side story. He lived for a very, very old age. He was one of the Sahaba who outlived most of them. The Prophet ﷺ lived in his house while the Prophet's house and the mosque was being built. When the first expedition, the military expedition to Turkey, Constantinople happened, Abu Ayyub was still alive. He was very old, but he was still alive. And Abu Ayyub said, I want to die a shaheed. So I will go on this expedition. And he got on a boat. He was taken all the way to the expedition, and he got on a horse, but he was so old he couldn't ride the horse. So he said, tie me to the saddle. So they tied him to the saddle, and he was amongst the first soldiers, and he fought his way right up to the walls of Constantinople, and he died in the walls of Constantinople, and they buried him there. Now that first expedition that we all know, if you know history, was not successful. The Muslims could not take Constantinople, and the Byzantines retained that land, and Abu Ayyub's grave was forgotten. No one knew where it was. 700 years later, Sultan Fatih Mehmed II, where's Hoja gone? Every time I say Sultan Fatih Mehmed, if you're Turkish, their chest gets a little bit bigger. Sultan Fatih Mehmed II takes an expedition to Constantinople, and they're besieging Constantinople, and they're not getting through. It's been months, I think it's a few years that actually took, and they're starting to get tired and drained. And when morale was dropping and hope was starting to fall, Sultan Fatih Mehmed's sheikh, who was with him, sees a dream. And in his dream, he is shown the place where Abu Ayyub is buried. Sultan Fatih Mehmed takes his soldiers and they dig the ground and they actually find Abu Ayyub Ansari's grave. And this boosts morale. All the soldiers suddenly see it as a miracle, morale boost, and a few months later, the walls of Constantinople falls, and to this day it remains on Muslim hands. This is the link between Abu Ayyub al-Ansari and Istanbul that we have. And they built a mosque, and to this day you can go to the mosque and see the burial site of Abu Ayyub al-Ansari. Isn't that I love that connection, it's beautiful. Goes from a Sahaba who wasn't really that big, he just managed to be smart enough to grab the Prophet's belongings before anyone else did. And because of him, we have Istanbul and one of the greatest capitals of the Ottoman Empire. Who would have thought? 700 years. Yeah. Exactly. Now, I'm going to wrap up fairly soon. I know that we're getting close to the end. The first two things the Prophet ﷺ did when he came to Mecca was he built the mosque, and he did another thing. He built, Medina, you're right. When he came to Medina, he built a mosque, and he built one other thing, which was a marketplace. A free market, yes. And the reason was the Prophet ﷺ does two things. He has the Muslims set up their own marketplace, and he sets out the building of the mosque. That is Islam right there. Deen and dunya together. We have our own place to worship, and we have to maintain the economy, integrity, and independence, and that's the foundation and strength of the people. The Prophet ﷺ didn't only focus on the religious part, he focused on the physical part. He created a market where the Muslims could be independent and establish themselves independently financially. And over the years, the Prophet ﷺ manages to unite the Aus and Khazraj from their tribal systems to a united front as Muslims. And I'll really quickly read a section. It's like this. It says, the condition of life in Medina was totally different from those that the Muslims had experienced in Mecca. There in Mecca, they used to strive for one corporate target, but physically they were scattered, overpowered, and abandoned. They were helpless in terms of pursuing their new course of orientation. Their means socially and materially fell short of establishing a new Muslim community. In parallel lines, the Meccan chapter, the Noble Quran, were confined to describing the Islamic principles, establishing legislation pertaining to the believers individually, and enjoining good and piety and forbidding evils and vices. In Medina, however, things were otherwise. Here, all the affairs of their lives rested in their hands. Now they were at ease and could quite comfortably handle the challenges of civilization, construction, means of living, economics, politics, government, administration, war, and peace, classification of the questions of the allowed and prohibited, worship, ethics, and all the relevant issues. Briefly, they were in Medina at full liberty to erect the pillars of the new community, not only totally different from that pre-Islamic code of life, but also distinctive in its features in the world as a whole. Allah the All-Knowing, of course, undertook legislation, and His Prophet Muhammad ﷺ explanation and implementation and reformation. So in Mecca, they were struggling just barely to keep their spiritual lives alive under the persecution. But in Medina, they now have freedom for everything: military, finance, economy, administration, trading, everything, and suddenly peace. They suddenly get this overwhelming sense of peace. And I think we'll stop there. Next week, inshallah, we will cover a very amazing Sahaba who now happens to meet the Prophet ﷺ while he is in Medina. And we'll touch on his story. Inshallah. All right, thank you everyone. Assalamu alaikum. That's all. That's why I went a little over today. So probably what? Yes.
Make it after Maghreb, like between Maghreb and Isha. Come and pray Maghreb, and then we do the class.
To make it earlier. That'd be a bit hard for everyone.
Maybe 6